All right, thank you very much. Yeah, I spent the last 15 years of my working life working in flood risk management in the UK, and recently returned to Canada. I'm here today to talk to you about the experiences in the UK. It's undergoing some quite significant transformational change in how they manage water in response to some flooding and to other events, and I thought it would be useful to come here and perhaps reassure people like Jay, who says that implementing new policies takes some time and there's delays, and I think later on you'll see it's no different in the UK. So today we'll discuss how water was historically managed in England and Wales, and there is an important distinction there between the UK and England and Wales and Scotland, etc., which we don't really need to go into, but prior to 2010. The legislative framework that led to the need for change. I'm going to present to you a case study from a flood event in June of 2007, which sort of led to the change, and I'll show a 3-minute video there, which I think it gives a really good overview of what happened and all of the sources of flooding and the reason why they sort of went down the route for change. We'll talk about the government's response to the floods and the ensuing act, which has sort of has been a game changer over there. And then perhaps lessons isn't the right word to use. We'll ask a few questions about whether there's things that we could learn from how the UK has managed things. Right, okay. So historically, water in the UK was managed in this triangle here. You see water supply. It was homeowners and utility companies. Drainage was managed by individuals for private properties. Utility companies managed the public sewers. Local authorities, counties, the Highways Agency responsible for the motorways and trunk roads, etc. Then you had rivers, which were managed partly by riparian owners and local authorities. But then we had the Environment Agency, which is sort of like Alberta Environment, I guess, but they were historically known as the National Rivers Authority until 1997. But they changed their name and rebranded and became the Environment Agency. But they're responsible in part for each of those three elements of water. So they have quite a significant role. So here's the legislative framework. Now, the thing that I wanted to show on this graphic is that there are 9 different acts, each of which places a different responsibility on different organizations, different individuals, private companies. So you can see, for example, the Land Drainage Act puts responsibilities on the Environment Agency, riparian owners, local authorities, internal drainage boards. There's quite a few different people involved in different elements of managing water. Then on top of those UK or England and Wales acts, you also had legislation which came in from Brussels. Being a member state of the European Union, we had directives come through, like the Water Framework Directive, which was mostly related to some water quality and issues around water quality. And then we had, the EU Floods Directive, which placed responsibilities on member states to produce flood risk management plans and to adequately map their flood risk. Now, the United Kingdom was well advanced on that. They had elements of their mapping in place already and management plans. However, other member states such as Bulgaria and some of the other Eastern European states had very little in terms of management plans. So the point of that is just to show you how many different sort of bits of legislation and directives and things that applied. So now I'll show you a case study here from a flood that occurred in June of 2007. Now, Hull, you can see, is just located there. That's the River Humber there, which obviously is an estuary which flows out into the North Sea. It's located, so it's where the red dot is there, that's Hull. And you can see that on the west half of the United Kingdom is a very, very wet part of the world. In some places, like up in northern Scotland there, that's the Highlands of Scotland. it shows greater than 3,000 millimeters. Well, parts there receive greater than 4,000 to 4,500 millimeters of rain per year. So that's, I don't know how high this room is, but probably about 5 meters. But the point here is that Hull is actually located in a fairly dry part of the United Kingdom. It receives maybe 600 to 700 millimeters of rain a year, something like that. And it's largely protected by a spine of quite large hills that run down the center of the country. They're called the Pennine Fells. So the relevant statistics, okay, it's 600 to 700 millimeters of rainfall per year. It wasn't generally on the radar as somewhere that was, perceived as being a high flood risk area. Everybody knew that, flooding could occur anywhere in the United Kingdom, but it wasn't generally somewhere that the press looked to when there was a flood event. Nobody really spoke of it much. Now, that a combined drainage system built, in the 1800s, whenever they sort of the Victorians built their drains, but it had been significantly upgraded in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, so that capacity, I think, had been more than doubled. So, they had, by UK standards, a very modern drainage system. It was, however, pumped for a large part of it because Hull was a very low-lying city, and they upgraded it and replaced pumping stations and improved the network somewhat. However, to meet water quality objectives in the River Humber, they had to reduce the capacity of the drainage system by 50% in the 90s. So, however, the sewerage undertakers, Yorkshire Water, were able, in the event of a flood, to flip the pumps back on and sort of increase it back up to, this level here. So, right, I'm just going to briefly pop out of this for a second, and I'll put a video on, which I hope, it's about 3 minutes long. I'm going to play it right to the end to give the fellow credit, that did it. It was actually prepared by a high school student who was visiting the UK for a year from Sierra Leone. I hope you can understand the accents because they're quite strong, but the important bit is to take from it is the imagery. So.
Throughout yesterday and overnight, rescuers have worked tirelessly to help those trapped by the floodwaters. In the early hours of this morning, authorities evacuated...
As floods continue to ravage many parts of Britain, northeast Lincolnshire, including Grimsby, Immingham and Cleethorpes, some businesses in the town centre can only hope their insurance will cover them to get back up and running. Others are still trying to keep going.
I've got to open the chip shop. That's the one shop that's actually dry, but apparently it's going to rise into there soon.
There's about 7 inches of water floating around in the bar at the moment.
Normally, when it rains here in England, it can be heavy, but does not really last too long. Yesterday was heavy and it went on for hours. It started on Sunday night, then rained all night, all day Monday. By the morning, a lot of roads were flooded. Cars were driving through a foot of water, and some roads were impassable. By lunchtime, schools had started closing and businesses were sending their workers home. We left college at around 2 in the afternoon, and what would normally be a 15-minute drive home took nearly 2 hours in the pouring rain. Cars had broken down on the road. The drains were overflowing. Roads were like rivers. Police and fire brigade everywhere out. The parts and roads nearby French John's house was flooded, at least 10 feet deep. It was exciting and mad, but it is a bit scary too. We know that the climate is changing. We hear about it on TV and read about it in the newspapers, but it is strange when you actually start seeing it with your own eyes, the effect of it for yourself. This is Bame Boy reporting about the devastating rain yesterday that caused a lot of flood around the street of Hull and beyond. And in the studio with me I have 3 pretty young ladies from Wilberforce College that are going to talk about the flood yesterday. So yes, I start with you, madam. So what do you think about the flood yesterday?
It was really bad yesterday. I was only walking in the rain for like 10 minutes and my jeans were completely drenched, and that was only in the morning, and the rain just kept getting worse like throughout the day. And it just kept building up, and roads were closed, and I got stuck in college for like an hour and maybe 2 hours because there was no buses, and like, because all the roads were closed, no cars could get to a college. So we ended up walking halfway home, and I had to walk through like maybe 7-inch deep puddles. So by the time I got home, I was really wet, like really wet.
Like, as Shona said, the weather was like stupid. It was just raining all day. There was like puddles past your ankles and stuff. But I was walking to the bus stop from college and I didn't want to walk through the puddle. So someone from across the road ran and carried me across the puddle. And then we went across to the bus stop, but we got like soaked along the way and it took me 3 hours to get home because of the floods. So it wasn't good.
Well, yesterday, as Shauna and Annie have told you, the weather was really bad. There was like 2 months worth of rain, and just walking from Woolworths to work, which is like a minute away, I got absolutely drenched.
Okay, so if you could just keep in mind all those images of flooding that the various, throughout the city there was flooding on motorways, there was flooding in parks, there was flooding in housing estates, there was flooding, even the chip shop flooded apparently, so that was a disaster for the English. Right. So the impact of the flood. Now, 110 millimeters of rain fell in 24 hours. Now that actually, it may sound like a lot in Alberta, which it probably would be, but in the UK that's not that unusual. You know, it probably happens in the wetter side of the country once or twice a year. The largest flood event, the largest rainfall event in 24 hours was, I think, 341 millimeters over 24 hours in the Lake District, which was about 30 miles from where I lived. You know, so that's like that much rain in 24 hours. There were 5 deaths, not all of them in Hull. Across the country, there were 5 deaths. One was caused in Hull by a man who was trying to clear out a surface water drain. He got stuck in it, and unfortunately, he died from hypothermia. There were 7,000 houses and 1,300 businesses flooded from surface water flooding in Hull. Sheffield and Doncaster are south of Hull, but they were flooded from fluvial flooding from the River Don. And across the rest of the country, it was, you know, there were quite a few other areas that were affected. I'm going to show you a photograph next of a reservoir which very nearly failed. You can see there the impounding structure. There was about, well, a few hours where the Environment Agency and the local authorities believed that the whole thing was going to go, so they closed that road there. That's quite a busy A road, which, you know, trying to think of a traffic-wise, you know, there'd be cars constantly streaming down there. They had to close that. There was a village, or, you know, what we'd probably consider to be a town or even maybe a city in Alberta downstream of that. So if that had let go, there would have been, you know, a lot of devastation. So that was another problem from that flood. Now the government afterwards looked at where the responsibilities lie for the flooding, because, you know, if you remember that video, all the different areas that were flooded, well, who's actually responsible for improving their drainage or trying to prevent it from happening again? You had the Environment Agency responsible for the rivers, and Sheffield and Doncaster, you know, they played a role, but in Hull, you had the County Council responsible for secondary roads, Yorkshire Water responsible for sewerage and the pumping stations. You had the Highways Agency responsible for the motorways, or, you know, the sort of Highway 2 type roads. You had the City Council that were responsible for all the drainage amongst the housing estates and everywhere else. So there wasn't really a clear picture of who needed to do what to improve things. And this fellow T.J. Coulthard, he was a professor at the University of Hull. And in the Journal of Flood Risk Management in 2010, he wrote that the disaggregation of the governance and management of drainage led to an unclear or a non-existent chain of responsibility for surface water flooding in urban areas. So that, you know, put it pretty succinctly and sort of summed up the state of affairs with regards to drainage. So the government commissioned a fellow called Sir Michael Pitt, and he was the chair of the Infrastructure Planning Commission. So he looked after large infrastructure projects like motorways and railway lines and things like that, and getting planning approved for them. It's now disbanded, but He was asked by ministers to review the summer floods of 2007 and to write a report and make some recommendations. Out of that report, there were 92 recommendations. Now, he obviously had quite a lot to say. Most of the recommendations were sort of a little bit too specific to be of relevance sort of on a national scale, but there were 3 which led in part to changes in the UK law. Recommendation 1, the number 1 recommendation: given the predicted increase in the range of future extremes of weather, the government should give priority to both adaptation and mitigation in its programs to help society cope with climate change. But you'll see in the video there, the fellow high school student, first thing he talked about was, we know the climate's changing, we need to do something about it. First recommendation here, Sir Michael Pitt, climate change. His recommendation number 10, the automatic right to connect to surface water drainage of new developments to the sewage system should be removed. Now, historically in the UK, when a developer bought a piece of land, they got planning permission to build on that land, they had an automatic right to connect into the sewage system. Now, in the cities like Hull, where the sewage system was a combined system, that obviously is a sort of a ticking time bomb. Eventually, you're going to have too much water going into it. So Michael Pitt said, let's remove that automatic right. And recommendation number 28 said that the forthcoming legislation should be a single unifying act that addresses all sources of flooding, clarifies responsibilities, and facilitates flood risk management. Now, thinking back to that graphic that I showed you with the legislative framework there, he's basically saying, I want you to take all of those and sort of put it all together and make sure in this new act that we're going to bring out that it clarifies who's responsible for what. So the UK introduced the Flood and Water Management Act. Now this act sort of came out of the Pitt Review, came out of the European Union Floods Directive, and it's basically clarified who is responsible for flooding. It said the Environment Agency will be responsible for main rivers, estuaries, and the sea. It created this concept of lead local flood authorities who would be responsible for surface water, groundwater, and ordinary or what we consider non-navigable watercourses. It empowered the LLFA by creating SUDS approval bodies. When I refer to SUDS, I sort of broadly similar to low-impact drainage or low-impact development. Now, the SUDS approval bodies would basically adopt all LID SUDS structures and in the future maintain them. So they would be responsible for everything to do with the LID structures. And it introduced the concept of national standards for sustainable drainage. And finally, it did remove the automatic right to connect to the sewage network. So it created a system whereby you had to prove that you could not, have a soak-away infiltration drainage or swales or whatever to, and only as a last resort could you connect into the sewers. They also brought out a new planning policy framework, which this is important in my presentation because it again talks about climate change, and it says local planning authorities should adopt proactive strategies to mitigate and adapt to climate change, taking full account of flood risk, coastal change, and water supply and demand considerations. And the overriding theme that we've seen throughout this presentation is the UK are taking climate change very seriously. Okay, so this is where I think maybe other countries could be reassured that things don't change easily. The implementation has been phased to enable the LLFAs to prepare, but the national standards that I spoke about for LID or SUDS are now unlikely to be produced until 2014. Now, when we think that this review took place or for floods that occurred in 2007, we're now 7 years down the road. The draft consultation for these national guidelines and standards, actually the consultation period ended in December 2011, and the government is stalling on it. It's because the economic climate in the UK hasn't been conducive to implementing new requirements. So basically, the house building lobby are perhaps accused of being so strong that they can prevent the government from introducing and implementing these guidelines. And so that, that's certainly an issue over there. And over half of engineers at a recent conference felt the government wasn't committed to implementing the changes. Now they've passed this act, so that, the changes are going to go through, but I think there's a bit of stalling there until the next election because they're a bit worried about damaging the UK economy even further. So So what lessons can be taken? Well, this is off the City of Edmonton LID guidelines, and I just wanted to show here that there's a number of different bylaws and bits of legislation that apply to LID here, and yeah, it's just, it may not be similar to the UK, but there are a number of different bylaws, and each city has its own bylaws in relation to LID. So what can Alberta learn? What can we learn from them? Well, would we benefit from provincial standards or guidelines? Well, the UK are trying to implement them, but they're not being very successful. So I don't actually know the answer to that question. It might be nice to try. This, I believe, the City of Calgary are trying in the Pine Creek watershed to have LID compulsory for all new developments. I think that's a good idea, because what it does is it makes developers prove that they can't use LID, as opposed to just using as the default connecting into a sewerage or a traditional pipe system. We should ask ourselves, do we have a clear pathway for the maintenance for all LID schemes? Because with all of the delays in the UK of implementing the SUDS approval body and the adoption of the LID SUDS structures, we need to make sure that for all schemes that somebody's responsible for the maintenance, because we know that a lot of the systems don't work so well if they're not maintained properly. And climate change. Now this is something that the UK are taking very seriously, and for all of their drainage design, when you apply for planning permission, do a flood risk assessment, you have to include an analysis for climate change and in your hydrology estimates. And it's something that I've sort of got accustomed to doing, and I think it might be useful to always consider that in our design parameters. I think the biggest lesson is probably to act to change things when the economy's strong, because you're less likely to have powerful lobbies like house builders, affect political decisions and to sort of delay things. So.